Transformations have been a staple of Dragon Ball for as long as anyone can remember. Over 30 years later, and it still has the most influential and iconic transformation sequences in all of the anime, and you can argue with your mama about it, not me. Almost every single kid can tell you how the first Super Saiyan transformation made them feel, and they can definitely tell you the countless hours that they spent trying to go Super Saiyan, screaming at the top of their lungs, myself included, of course. So over the course of the series, as expected with power creep, we're introduced to more and more transformations, but I believe in the original series they were pretty tame with transformations and the amount that they introduced. That is up until we get to Dragon Ball Super, of course, where I believe over-relying on this trope of transformations. So today I want to answer the question, in my own opinion, of course, as usual, of how Dragon Ball Super could have handled transformations better throughout the series. And to do this, first I want to compare how Z handled transformations and then go on to how Super could have better handled them throughout the series. So sit back, thank you guys for the support that you've been showing. Happy New Year. This is the first video of the new year, and you know, let's get it done. So for a lot of us, Dragon Ball Z was the first place we were introduced to the idea of transformations in anime, unless you watched Sailor Moon. And before I get too deep in here, I want to acknowledge the Great Ape transformation, because that is technically where it all started in Dragon Ball, but it was never really tamed, like it was never really used to be like, you know, its own thing. So I don't really want to talk about it more than I have to. Now, again, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't at least know the term Super Saiyan. So I can't think of a better place to start, which, you know, from the Saiyan saga all the way up to the Frieza saga is when this transformation was talked about. We are told about the myth of the legendary Super Saiyan. As we progress from Earth to Namek, there's this looming idea of what it could be. This is Toriyama not only setting it up, but also adding to the mythological component of the transformation. We are told that the last Super Saiyan was over a millennium ago, and here we are with Vegeta and Frieza, two of the most powerful people in the series at this point. One who literally eradicated an entire planet out of the fear of that legendary warrior coming to defeat him, and the other, essentially the last vestige of Saiyan history, doing everything in his power to achieve this power, and, you know, of course, avenge his people. Then, when the time finally does come, it's due to Goku seeing the death of Krillin, his best friend who we've been with since the beginning of the story. He's been with Goku ever since he was a kid. And he dies with what seemed like no way to bring him back to life. Because if you remember, Krillin was already wished back with the Dragon Balls. You can only be revived with the Dragon Balls once in your entire lifetime, right? All this to say that the original Super Saiyan transformation was treated with respect. Toriyama gave the transformation its own in-universe lore, and subsequently, during the Cell Saga, every time it showed up, it felt like something of a spectacle. When Trunks first shows up and went Super Saiyan, the atmosphere of it was just this, it's just this awesome power that you're being introduced to again. And I mean, sure, we had just seen Goku take on Frieza for like 30 episodes, but now here is somebody else, Trunks, somebody we know absolutely nothing about, taking on not only Mecha Frieza but also King Cold. And while we do know that King Cold is not as strong as Frieza, no one else on Earth would have been able to actually put up a fight against him. And honestly, I don't even think at that point we knew that King Cold wasn't as strong, or if not stronger, than Frieza. So I'm just saying that was pretty epic. Then we move over to the first time Vegeta is introduced as a Super Saiyan, and he's not only putting up a fight against androids 19 and 20, but he has android 19 running for his life after he just murked android 20. All this to say that Super Saiyan was given the respect it deserved early on in the series, which naturally leads me to my next transformation, which is going to be Super Saiyan 2. And I'll acknowledge all the grades of the OG transformations leading up to this, you know, all the way to perfected Super Saiyan, I think it was. But, you know, to give them their own time, it's kind of a waste if we're being honest. So Super Saiyan 2 is arguably the only transformation, I believe, in my opinion, I'm gonna put that right there, that little asterisk right there, in my opinion, that can rival the OG transformation in terms of being iconic. Gohan had always been hyped up as the only person who could truly surpass Goku, and Cell had been hyped up as this ultimate warrior, with him not only being an amalgamation, sorry, of the DNA of all the Z fighters and everyone they've ever fought, but a villain even greater than the androids that everyone had been struggling to fight up until this point throughout the entire saga. While the transformation itself has this emotional buildup and payoff of Gohan finally letting out all of his anger, something that we had seen also been building up throughout the entire series, it also comes off the idea of surpassing the limits of the previous generation, which I thought was a great way to end the arc and arguably the entire series, but you know, that's either here nor there. The transformation that we had spent so many chapters on essentially revering had been surpassed, like if you really think about it. The limits of the legendary Super Saiyan had been broken, which makes perfect sense with the idea of him being a half-blooded Saiyan, which Vegeta had always said all the way back in the Saiyan saga tend to be more powerful than full-blooded Saiyans because they're more tenacious. And before we do end the Z portion of this video with Super Saiyan 3, I want to quickly acknowledge the fusion that Piccolo underwent with Kami. So Namekian's fusing was introduced first in the Frieza saga. Sorry, my light went out. I'm trying to turn it back on. So Namekian's fusing was first introduced in the Frieza saga with Piccolo and Nail, and while it did do something in the fight against Frieza, it wasn't truly until the fight against Cell and the androids that it really felt, you know, truly relevant. If you guys can remember, it had Imperfect Cell running, and Imperfect Cell was no joke. Like, let's just put that out there. But Piccolo was just, you know, aura farming as usual, but there's also it making him relative to Android 17, and I don't know if you remember properly, but not even Super Saiyan could do that at the time. Like Vegeta got packed up out of there, bro. Let's just keep it, let's call a spade a spade. Super Saiyan, it wasn't rivaling the androids. So even transformations that had nothing to do with Saiyans were shown some form of respect in Z. Now to end it all off, I want to talk about the Buu Saga, which is where I honestly believe transformations are beginning to not hold as much weight. You know, every Saiyan by this point, half-blooded or not, could at least go Super Saiyan. Goku and Vegeta had achieved Super Saiyan 2. This is where the name of Super Saiyan 2 was finally like mentioned, because of course there'd be a Super Saiyan 3. Then there's Goku and Gotenks with Super Saiyan 3, and Gotenks having Super Saiyan 3 doesn't bother me that much. He's a fusion, so you know, it's a relatively tame thing. Now, even though I do believe that by the Buu Saga transformations hold less weight, I think this is Toriyama putting more stock into fighting as a unit with fusions and team-ups, as in, you know, Goten and Trunks fighting together, and then Goku and Vegeta fighting together, and we see more of this in Super, so I'll give them credit on that. But still, Goku going Super Saiyan is still treated as this awesome moment, and this was translated into the real world with this rumor of Sean Schimmel passing out during the Super Saiyan 3 transformation. He wasn't, but you know, let's just say that. But there was also the limiter of it using so much energy that it caused Goku to use up his time on Earth, because he was only back in Earth for the day, because he was still dead. All this to say that in Z, transformations were always treated with respect when they were introduced. They weren't just things pulled out of nowhere randomly, right? You know, the closest we got to that was Super Saiyan 3, and even then, not really. But let's move on to how Super handles its transformations, shall we? Super was a breath of fresh air for fans at the time, myself included. You know, it was the first time that we were seeing new weekly Dragon Ball content in over 20 years. You know, I still remember the feeling of being able to watch new Dragon Ball episodes with Goku and the Z Fighters. With, you know, it was just, I remember sitting on my porch and just being like, wow, I'm going to see new Dragon Ball content in my lifetime, you know, because I didn't grow up watching Z as it came out, you know. It was like just reruns, which it was new to me. It was new to me kind of thing. But, you know, everyone was experiencing it at the same time for once, you know. But, of course, with this also came new transformations, you know, the first of which being Super Saiyan God, that was first introduced in the Battle of Gods movie that came out 2 years prior in 2013. But Super had the brilliant idea to retread that content. And, you know, I will admit that Super Saiyan God being introduced in the Super anime benefited it more because it gave it this more mythical kind of thing, akin to how they did with the original Super Saiyan. You know, it was first alluded to us through the Oracle Fish talking to Beerus, you know, the god of destruction at the time. But I just don't like when they retread anime content. I don't like when, movie content. I don't like when animes did that. The Boruto anime did it. I didn't like it. It really left a bad taste in my mouth. But the Oracle Fish alluded to, Beerus, that a warrior called the Super Saiyan God would emerge powerful enough to at least give him a challenge, if not defeat him. It was exciting because people have long made many fan transformations for years after Super Saiyan 4 in GT, and now here it was finally being canonized. Of course, Super Saiyan 4 still isn't canon, still wasn't, and isn't, because, it's stuck in Daima and in GT, but still, new transformation. We saw as Beerus found Goku, challenged him, and absolutely destroyed him, with what we had seen up until that point being the most powerful transformation with Super Saiyan 3 with ease. At the time, it was crazy. It was a form that had been able to at least keep up with Kid Buu, the most powerful fighter that we've seen up until this point. And the God form was seen as something more mythical because you had to perform an entire ritual with 6 Saiyans, coincidentally the same amount of Saiyans that they had at the time, but whatever, Toriyama. But still, it wasn't a rage-based transformation, which once again was a new idea that was being introduced. The form looked like a base Goku with red to pinkish hair color, which just added to the coolness of it, right? Because it seemed to introduce this introduction of a whole new line of transformations. Then there's the entire fight with Beerus itself, with Goku having to adapt to the God Ki being introduced to his body. Everything about how it was handled just seemed perfect at the time, right? And then, of course, the next transformation that we are introduced to would be Super Saiyan Blue. Of course, when it dropped, it was called Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, which is, should have been an indicator that they were just kind of throwing stuff at the board at that point, And I will admit that though Super Saiyan Blue in concept, it made sense. It was the addition of Super Saiyan on top of Super Saiyan God, so it follows that lineage, that new line of transformations that I thought about. I think the problem came in where it was really the first form we ever saw that just kind of happened. And I mean, Super Saiyan 3 did kind of just happen, but it wasn't this thing that was with ease. Super Saiyan 3 happened with a struggle. It was the longest transformation sequence we had seen up until that point. I still think it is. I'm not 100% sure. But Super Saiyan Blue just kind of popped out. Goku and Vegeta had it, I think the problem really came in where there wasn't any real build up to it. It was introduced in probably the least liked parts about Super, which would be Resurrection F, and it also made a previous form that we'd only seen once irrelevant, which was crazy. I know I say that a lot. And there's also the fact of them bringing back Frieza, which, okay, whatever, I didn't necessarily like it, but it made some sense with them wishing him back with the Dragon Ball, until he also came back with a new form that eclipsed all the growth between Namek up until now. But whatever, because he trained for like a couple months, I don't know, it just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, and then again, Super Saiyan God had so much potential for growth, the same way that the original Super Saiyan had potential for, didn't have potential, it grew before we introduced Super Saiyan 2. All of that robbed for a hype moment is essentially what we got. Now, not everything has to be done the same way that the first Super Saiyan transformation was. I just want transformations to feel the same level of reverence that they once did in the original Z. And now, before I end it off, I don't want to talk too much about Ultra Instinct because I think it was handled well enough. I just wish it was more of a technique than a transformation, to make the previous transformations relevant again, which is what I think Super Saiyan God should have done. They could have done that and applied that logic to Ultra Instinct. So I want to talk about other transformations we saw from Piccolo and Gohan. So I think Piccolo getting ultimate form and then the orange form makes sense since it's connected to Shenron. Again, he trains a lot, but the leap, whatever, I just think it makes sense because you're bringing back a character other than a Saiyan and making them interesting while still honoring his original powers all the way throughout the OG series. Then there's Beast, which in isolation is very cool to me. I made a video on this. There's the Gohan video of why Dragon Ball needs to let Gohan go. I'll link it in the description, but I do like Beast in isolation, but it's essentially just a reference to Super Saiyan 2, which also speaks to a problem I have with Super overall. Most transformations except Ultra Instinct is just a color palette swap, with it just making them relevant to the universe all of a sudden. And look, I know I said I loved Super Saiyan God and it just being a palette color swap with base Goku, but I just think it's the coolest palette color swap of base Goku. Super Saiyan Blue just being Super Saiyan with blue hair sucks. It sucks. I don't know. Super Saiyan God, yeah, aura, bro. Super Saiyan Blue, It don't. It don't. But let's end it off. Transformations in Dragon Ball used to feel relevant and earned. You know, the OG Super Saiyan was a saga-long buildup. Then Super Saiyan 2 followed suit while also paying off a series-long buildup up until that point, with Gohan becoming the strongest warrior. Now, while Super Saiyan 3 came out of nowhere, it didn't make Super Saiyan 2 irrelevant, which is a very important thing. While the form was powerful, the price was your ki being drained at an alarming rate, more so than the previous transformations would have done. You know, there was a consequence of using it, making Super Saiyan 2 the more favorable transformation. And they kind of did do this in the super manga. They did it in the super manga. Dragon Ball Super in the actual manga is so much better. You know, in Super Saiyan God was a welcome addition that was then later overshadowed by Blue immediately after, and it didn't even show up in the anime until the Tournament of Power. Like I said, in the manga it did show up, you know, here and there. And now, while Blue was the main transformation during Super, it suffers because it was used for everything, and I literally mean everything. I'm looking at you, Krillin and Android 17. That fight is bullshit. It's so stupid. You know, it doesn't make any sense to me. I also just realized that I didn't really talk about Ultra Ego, which is funny because I feel like that says a lot about how the transformation was treated in its introduction. I know it's only been in one arc, but you know, a form that's meant to get stronger the more damage it took lost because it took too much damage. Just, that was so stupid to me. But you know, the point of this video being Dragon Ball Super not only introduced too many transformations, but also just didn't treat them how they deserved. And once again, I think this is the product of Dragon Ball going on too long and just needs to find a proper way to wrap up. I feel like all my Dragon Ball videos and all my problems with Dragon Ball are gonna stem from this fact, so get used to it the more I make these videos, man. I just really want Dragon Ball to have a good ending. But you know, that's the video, and as usual, tell me what you guys think, leave a comment below, and if you enjoyed, please consider leaving a sub and a like. I love you guys, and this year we're gonna go crazy the videos, man. I got a goal to hit 10k subs by the end of the year. You know, I really hope you guys stick around and follow me along this journey. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.